the Steve Scalise shooting, the Jeff Sessions testimony, and the Alex Jones interview. I'm Donna Davis, and this is the Square Circle.
Launch a new charity or need to raise funds, Voluntary Solutions can help. You have a passion for helping people. We have a passion for helping you. Visit voluntarysolutionsdc.com, 844-739-5488.
Hello, and welcome to the Square Circle. I'm your host, Donna Davis. Joining us today are policy analyst Joe Albanese, Jerrod Labor of Young Voices Advocates, and political reporter James Rosen. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you.
On Wednesday, a gunman attacked a group of Republican lawmakers, critically injuring House Majority Whip Steve Scalise. The shooter, who was shot by Capitol Police and later died, was later identified as a former volunteer for Senator Bernie Sanders' presidential campaign. This has been in the news nonstop. What do you say? Has this been politicized, or is it an appropriate reaction to the sadness of what has taken place?
Well, you've had pretty much a schizophrenic reaction. On one hand, you've had, and in some ways both are predictable. On one hand, you've had sort of contrite reactions from members of both parties in Congress and beyond, saying, you know, things have really gotten to an extreme, the anger, the hostility. Let's think about pulling things more toward the center and being more civil to each other. On the other hand, within hours of the shooting, you had some prominent Republicans and conservative voices blaming it on the left. Unfortunately, for Democrats, if you will, for liberals, the shooter apparently was a Bernie Sanders supporter. And Congressman King of New York, who's quite conservative, quite outspoken, quite often says controversial things, blamed it on a larger pattern of increasing violence on the left toward President Trump. Now, there may be a grain of truth in that, but I mean, I think the two things to remember are, one, this shooter apparently had mental problems, as most shooters, if not all shooters in these regrettably too frequent shootings over the years are shown to have. You know, they're mentally unstable. But beyond that, I would argue that President Trump, during his campaign, and I know that his supporters are not going to like to hear this, but I think it's indisputably true, during his campaign, he both incited violence and, more long-term, he has helped to normalize what I would call hatred and hostility. He's brought it more into the mainstream. He's brought people out of the woodwork. And I think people like extreme people on the left, Bernie Sanders supporters, feel like they're responding to that. Now, I don't necessarily agree with that, but this is not just a problem of the left or the right, but I put some responsibility for this increased level of hostility and violence at the feet of President Trump.
Jerrod, how do you feel about how this has turned in terms of the news?
Excuse me. So I am very reticent to put this on, blame this on polarization or anything like that. When it comes down to it, at the end of the day, blaming on anything other than the shooter robs individuals of their agency. Whether he was, there might be some mental health issues and whatnot, but when it comes down to it, the responsibility comes to the man who pulled the trigger. It's when you get into these debates on whether or not polarization or continuing ideology has a role. It's just you get into this forest that is just really impossible to really see anything clearly, and politics has a way of further sort of obscuring what in a lot of people's minds, in my mind in particular, is a fairly simple matter. I mean, you have a man who committed an act of violence, and I think it's as simple as that.
Joe, is there another way that you feel that the media could have handled the post-shooting day?
I think for the most part, people were on board with the idea that this isn't really anyone's fault but the shooter, and that this shouldn't be used for politics. But it's the exceptions to that which stand out the most, unfortunately. One of the biggest exceptions, I think, was when the New York Times yesterday in their editorial blamed this instance on Bernie Sanders, but also took the time to blame the 2011 shooting of Gabrielle Giffords on Sarah Palin, which is something that we thought that had been disputed and debunked a long time ago. So to pull that back up, it seems like they were taking the worst of both worlds, where most people would say it's neither side's fault, really, except maybe I agree with James that there's probably too much of a tolerance of violence in the society, but the New York Times decided to say that, yes, it's both sides' faults in both cases, and that seems to be the worst side of all in this.
And there's another piece of this beyond pure politics. It's related to politics, but and that's gun control. People forget there was an assault weapons ban for 10 years. I believe it started in the mid-'90s. It lasted to the mid-2000s, and then it came up for renewal, and it failed. And I think it came up for renewal once or twice since then, and it's failed. When we had the assault weapons ban for 10 years, you saw less of these mass serial madmen killings using assault rifles. Doesn't mean they didn't happen. They happened with other weapons. But as we saw in this shooting, this was an assault rifle, and the guy by some accounts, was able to get off 50 up to 100 shots in a very short period of time. And that's why the assault weapons ban existed, is to, if you do have a crazy guy, don't let him have an assault weapon. He has no need for an assault weapon. So I think that's an important piece of
I would push back on that a little bit, just because, I mean, the calls for gun control, I think that if there is a solution that could be used with specific legislation, then by all means have that conversation. But those calls came far too early in the situation, where we didn't know where the guy came from, where he got his gun, whether it was legal, whether it was even an assault rifle. I'm not sure if it was, but
I think it was an assault rifle.
I read different reports about that, but I think that in any case, like you had people like David Frum coming out within hours of it happening saying, Virginia doesn't have background checks, they do, and he wasn't from Virginia, and just sort of listing out a litany of policy prescriptions where there wasn't any call for them yet. There shouldn't have been any evidence.
Well, just because there was mistaken reporting doesn't delegitimize my point, which is that assault, I covered the Pentagon for a couple of years. Military people, intelligence people will tell you that normal citizens have no business, in most cases, having assault weapons. That's the only point I'm making.
I'd like to remind our viewers that you can submit your questions to our guests through our website, www.publicsquare.net, and we'll answer as many as we can live on air toward the end of the show. Jerrod, do you have any thoughts about this back and forth regarding the use and ban or considered ban of these types of weapons?
So it's a complicated issue. I'm generally not in favor of prohibitions or bans, but at the same time, I'm sympathetic to the idea that your ordinary human doesn't have a need for an assault. I have no need for an assault weapon, and I have no desire for one. But at the same time, these issues of violence and guns, violence just in general, and the trends, they're very complicated. And there's a lot of, it's not monocausal. There's a lot of factors that go into anything like this. So while I'm generally sympathetic to, I'm not sold on guns, one way or the other. I think it's an open question in a lot of scenarios. But I would say it's a murky issue.
It always reminds me that the whole reason that we have the right to bear weapons is because way back when we were worried that our government might do something we totally disagreed with, and we wanted to be able to form our own militia. And it seems like that's no longer even on the table as part of the discussion as to why we might allow a certain type of weapon. Has that gone?
The term in the Constitution is a well-regulated militia. And I don't think that suggests citizens just kind of meeting on street corners and with guns and turning. I mean, there might be a scenario where you'd want to do that, but the term in the Constitution is a well-regulated militia. The founding fathers, especially Madison, who pretty much wrote the Constitution, chose his words carefully, and I think there's a reason why he said well-regulated militia.
That's a fair point. Also this week, Attorney General Jeff Sessions appeared before the Senate Intelligence Committee. Here's a tense exchange between Sessions and Senator Ron Wyden.
Mr. Comey said that there were matters with respect to the recusal that were problematic and he couldn't talk about them. What are they?
Why don't you tell me? There are none, Senator Wyden. There are none. I can tell you that for absolute certainty. This is a secret innuendo being leaked out there about me, and I don't appreciate it.
It certainly seemed, Joe, that Senator Wyden was getting nowhere in terms of his attempts to draw Sessions out. Do you think there was a better way to reach him?
Well, I think that the way that he could have reached him, well, they were probably limited in this case. I think Sessions, for many Democratic senators, was pretty adamant about not disclosing what his conversations with the president were. And he gave some justification about that it was longstanding DOJ policy, wasn't really able to be specific on that. At the same time, Wyden in this case sort of exemplified a potential issue with the Democrats' conduct in these investigations. I mean, the issues of collusion with Russia, obstruction of justice are hugely important issues. These are things that could potentially lead to further investigations, to impeachment or removal of some people from the White House, if not the president himself. But the fact that Wyden in this situation sort of accused in bad faith Sessions of not being forthcoming, of stonewalling the investigation, it's treating this situation and this process not with the soberness that it deserves, and it risks the Democrats looking like they're over their skis on this, that they're already looking for impeachment when the evidence of collusion or of obstruction of justice hasn't been fully found yet, and the case needs to be made to the public before that can happen. So Wyden in this situation sort of came across as someone who already knew what outcome he was looking for, and he had the self-righteousness to get there, and that definitely turned off Sessions. It might have turned off voters too.
So it sounds like he had an agenda and it was a little too obvious too early.
A little bit. I mean, which is not to say that other Democrats on the panel weren't more professional. They were. Many of them were still very tough on Sessions, on specifically the DOJ policy, whether or not he was allowed to disclose his conversations with the president. But they still were able to do so in a way that had enough deference to the separation of powers, to the importance of this process, that it didn't look like they were out with an agenda. And I think that's the biggest issue here, is that if the Democrats look like they're too eager to impeach the president too soon on too few evidence, they'll end up hurting themselves in the long run in this endeavor.
Jerrod, what are your thoughts in terms of how we can change the ambiance, the environment with this type of dialogue?
I mean, I think ultimately, so this whole thing with Russia collusion and everything, I think ultimately it's going to be a lot of smoke with no real substance behind it. I'm not suggesting that there wasn't. I mean, that there wasn't collusion. I don't think that the evidence exists. And this back and forth that we're having between the administration and members of Congress, where they're just simply denying everything or saying, in Sessions is sort of invoking executive privilege without actually invoking executive privilege. It sets up this scenario where basically now anything could potentially be, you could refuse to answer any question simply because maybe the president might someday invoke executive privilege. I think this is going to ultimately lead nowhere, and it's. I'm very skeptical of this ending in any sort of impeachment process or anything like that, just because I'm not certain that there's going to be tangible evidence that's ever going to be produced.
Huh. James, what are your opinions?
Well, I'm on record on this show and elsewhere saying repeatedly for several months now that diametrically the opposite view, that I don't know that there's going to be an impeachment, but I think there will be major consequences of this investigation. I think there's just too much smoke. I think the main thing is that President Trump really angered the intelligence communities, and I think they have it out for him. And I think for me, there's too much smoke to not believe that they have nothing on him. I believe they do. I don't know if they have it on him directly or on some of his former aides like Mr. Manafort. But there will be consequences here. I'm going to repeat it. I don't think this is just all smoke. But in terms of the hearing, let me say that I've covered Washington for 23 years. These public hearings on big, controversial, sensitive, explosive issues, they're largely theater. I'm not excusing one side or the other, but they're largely theater. The real work gets done behind closed doors. It gets done among aides. This is kind of kabuki theater. And Wyden has a reputation for being dramatic and pushing the envelope, but so does Senator Sessions. I covered him a lot when he was in the Senate. He has said some racist things in the past. He's not my favorite senator. I think he came in with his own strategy, which was he didn't want to, in the Republicans' view, get rolled the way I think they thought former Director Comey got rolled in his testimony. He didn't want to be seen as a patsy, so he came in kind of ready to be defiant. And I think those lines he said about the accusations of collusion are detestable and so forth, those were rehearsed lines. He was going to say that no matter what. So this was largely theater. I don't think it was. It's all entertaining to watch, but it's in the end it's not determinative.
Finally, new NBC anchor Megyn Kelly is in the news herself for her interview with radio host and conspiracy theorist Alex Jones, to be aired this Sunday. Here's an excerpt.
9/11.
Now, 9/11 was an inside job, but when I say inside job, it means criminal elements in our government working with Saudi Arabia and others wanted to frame Iraq for it. Just a fact.
Sandy Hook.
Well, Sandy Hook's complex because I've had debates where devil's advocates said the whole story's true, and then I've had debates where I've said that none of it's true.
When you say parents faked their children's death, people get very angry.
Yeah, well, I know, but they don't get angry about the 500,000 dead Iraqis from the sanctions, or they don't get angry about all the illegals.
That's a dodge.
No, it's not a dodge.
Jerrod, what say you? Do you think the flack that Megyn is taking is appropriate, or does she have a right to bring out this type of topic?
So obviously I don't think it was a strategic move for NBC, as we're hearing reports of advertisers dropping out and whatnot, or pulling out of the show. But at the same time, I am a firm believer that you can't be afraid of ideas, regardless of how ridiculous they are. And in some cases, in all cases, I would say the ridiculous ideas need to be put on the table so they can be dismissed. So I'm 100% comfortable with the idea of Alex Jones being interviewed on national television because that's how Marketplace of Ideas works.
The Marketplace of Ideas, but aren't there more valuable ideas that airtime might take up? What do you say, Joe?
I think that, the backlash against this is that people don't want Alex Jones to have a platform, and they're afraid that NBC is elevating him. The thing is, he's already been elevated over the last year. The current president has had a relationship with him and has, Alex Jones said that he called him after his election. That may or may not be true and may be self-aggrandizing, but it's undeniable that Alex Jones has had a bigger podium and a bigger platform recently. And the one way to get rid of an idea is to ridicule it or to show that it's grotesque or monstrous. And Alex Jones, by many accounts, is both these things. He said that the Sandy Hook shootings were a hoax. He's a conspiracy theorist who's very eccentric. I think to reveal that to the world might be the best medicine for his brand of demagoguery, and especially if Megyn Kelly is a tough questioner about it, which from the clip, from the few clips that have come out so far, it seems like she has been. We can reserve judgment until the full show has aired, but I don't have a problem with this in theory.
So in effect, they're letting him hang himself.
Yeah, I think letting his words speak for himself and his mannerisms speak for themselves would be the best antidote to any kind of Alex Jones epidemic.
James, what say you on
Well, I'm
this?
going to be the contrarian again. I'm Jewish. I have family members and family members of friends who suffered during the Holocaust. I grew up in a Holocaust survivor community. There are points of view that become so illegitimate that they're not allowed to be aired in public. The Nazi beliefs are one of them. The beliefs of the Ku Klux Klan are another one. I could give other examples. And so this is kind of the ACLU position that all views are, can be aired in our society, and that if you air them, they get knocked down and they get exposed. But that's not what happens. The history of our country is that these hateful views incite violence. They lead to hundreds, if not thousands, of deaths. And what happens when you allow someone like Alex Jones, he's a detestable person, and I'm going to say that publicly. He's a detestable person. He's a fraud. When you give him a platform, I'm a big admirer of Megyn Kelly. I really am. I thought the way she handled herself during the debates was extraordinary. So I admire her. But to give him a mainstream, high-profile platform, what it does is it legitimizes him. And she asks tough questions, but he weaseled his way out of. He did not take the same extreme stances that he has taken in the past. And so what ended up happening is he ends up being a more legitimate seeming figure, and that legitimizes some of his past detestable views. I think he has no place on that show, and I think it was a horrible decision by NBC.
Gentlemen, any rebuttal?
I guess the only rebuttal I would have is just that having a free exchange of ideas, I mean, the United States and Nazism in Germany, they're obviously different situations. There's a lot of things that can be said about them. But the fact that in this country, typically, traditionally, we've had stronger freedom of speech, and we've been able to have more of a moderate society that didn't turn towards fascism or communism or any of the extreme isms in the 20th century. I would attribute that to the fact that we don't, by not repressing ideas, we are able to allow people to see them for what they are and not feel like they are victimized or like they're being opposed by a bigger state that they need to therefore push back against. But I understand that it's a sensitive topic, and I don't think that it's illegitimate to think that Megyn Kelly made a mistake here by any means.
Should she interview the Grand Master of the Ku Klux Klan next? Should his views be allowed on a major TV show?
I mean, there are segments in the news all the time, I feel, that cover the dark side of American history and of human history, and I think that if that turns some people to that ideas, to those ideas, that's unfortunate, and that's obviously something that we should do our best to avoid by teaching them why these views are abhorrent. But to make them taboo, to not teach them what these ideas are or why they're wrong, that's something that could have a backfire effect, I feel.
Jerrod, do you think that will be brought out, that the wrongness, or do you think that it will be tempered and shown? Or do you think it'll just be a dialogue where she doesn't really get him to be seen as he truly is?
Well, I mean, he had said himself in a court case that he was playing a character. So he will definitely try to spin this in any way he possibly can to make himself look good, because now he has a large camera pointed at him.
All right, well, let's take some questions from our viewers. Okay, we have a question from Joy Simmons. Are there double standards regarding the Scalise shooting versus the Gabby Giffords shooting? James, I know you talked to this a little bit. Let's let one of the other gentlemen. Jerrod, do you want to take that?
So double standard. I don't think so. I think politics. The responses that you see, I think, I believe you said this earlier, are predictable, and politics is sort of a team sport, and so when one side is under attack, people on that team will dig in and go to bat. So I don't think it's a double standard so much as just people will pick their sides when they feel they're under attack.
Joe, how do you respond?
I would agree that there is one standard for both sides, that is, my side is right and your side is wrong, so not necessarily a double standard. But the fact is that there have been, I mean, I brought up the New York Times story, where they basically said that because Sarah Palin had like a map of districts that she was targeting, she had crosshairs on them, that caused Jerrod Lee Loughner to shoot Gabby Giffords. And the fact that that was rehashed as if it was a fact, I don't think it speaks to a media that wants to go out of its way to blame the right wing for everything, but I think it speaks to a sort of bubble at the very least, where if both sides are more inclined to be defensive of their own side, then people who share a certain viewpoint might be more inclined to do that. I don't think it's malicious. I think it's ignorance, and I think they should retract and apologize for that editorial.
James, we only have a moment. Do you want to chime in?
Just quickly, I don't really think there's a double standard, but I think the two situations were not exactly the same. As I recall, Giffords was shot very close up. She was outside a grocery store. It was her alone. She was the only congressperson. It wasn't a general shooting out in the baseball field.
Yes.
And also, to be honest, as liberated as we all want to think we are, I think the fact that she's a woman makes somewhat of a difference.
Huh. We have another question from Kent Wagner. Did Jeff Sessions help the Russia investigation or impede it? Joe, do you want to take that one?
I think that we didn't learn that much. It was funny how that hearing was so much different in tone from the James Comey hearings, yet they both kind of made the same amount of progress. We didn't learn that much from the hearings themselves. Comey released his memos, so we learned a great deal from that, and we learned about Mueller now. Special counsel Mueller is now investigating possibly President Trump for obstruction of justice, according to the Washington Post. Basically, I think that he was able to stifle it a little bit, but it's got momentum of its own.
Jerrod, what about you? How do you feel on this?
I'm in agreement with Joe. I don't think we learned anything new from this, and ultimately, and I guess I do kind of find myself in agreement with James that ultimately this will be hashed out, maybe behind the scenes.
Okay, and now it's time for the most underreported story of the week. Who'd like to start? James?
I'll start. It wasn't too long ago when the Greek economy was front page news, and people were following it. Reporters and commentators were reporting on it, following it breathlessly. Was it going to collapse? Was there going to be a big bailout and so forth? Greece, just in the last day or two, reached a tentative agreement with European creditors to prevent the latest in a string of possible collapses, and nobody paid any attention. It got virtually no news coverage, and I think it shows you what's happened in the age of Trump to, whether you want to call it real news or fake news, to other news.
So basically, Greek is kind of taking the bag of money and running.
Oh, we'll see. I didn't read the story. I guess I'll have to see if that's the case.
Jerrod, what do you think is the most underreported story of the week?
Well, it actually just broke I think 2 nights ago. It was overshadowed, of course, by the shooting yesterday in Alexandria. But Trump, it came out that Trump was going to allow Secretary Mattis to determine the troop increase level in Afghanistan. And this is another step in a line in which Trump is giving more autonomy to the Pentagon, in the war on terror and our conflicts overseas, which I ultimately think is not a good thing. I'm a believer in the civilian. I believe that military action should be subject to intense political constraints. Ultimately, I fear this would have the effect of inverting the civilian rule of the military over time.
Joe, what's your say on the most underreported story of the week?
Well, it was announced earlier this week that Rex Tillerson, Secretary of State, basically said that Palestinian leadership has decided that they're going to end their policy of paying the families of terrorists who are arrested for trying to harm Israelis, which is a huge step, because this was obviously a big thorn in the side of Israel, of the United States in the peace process, was that how can we trust you to negotiate in good faith when you are basically rewarding people who commit terrorism against Israelis. So the fact that this will now end, I think this is a great diplomatic accomplishment, and hopefully will lead to more peace in the future.
I certainly agree myself. All right, well, that's all for this week. I'm Donna Davis. Thanks for watching The Square Circle. We'll see you next week.